is a poet living in Louisville, Kentucky,
Yes, hi everyone.
where she's also the senior marketing and publicity director at Saraband Books. Joanna studied at Bellarmine University, Exeter College at the University of Oxford, and the University of Louisville. Her poems have been published or are forthcoming in The Pinch, Neon Door, Miracle Monocle, Tiny Spoon, Jabberwocky Review, and elsewhere. We also have Creative Nonfiction Emerging Artist Award recipient T. Jeremy Smith, writer, musician, and mental health counselor, originally from Black Dot, Kentucky. Diagnosed at age 10 with a degenerative retinal disease, Jeremy has written a memoir about his experience of travel, transformation, rock and roll, love, and loss, all while slowly going blind. Now residing in Lexington, Jeremy's work continues to expand. As he finishes his first novel, Jeremy is already on to other fictional pursuits focused on the margins and the magic in humanity. Fiction Emerging Artist Award recipient Haley Krieger is a writer, editor, and educator living in Kentucky. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Cincinnati, where she also teaches writing. In 2023, she received the Taft Competitive Dissertation Fellowship, the Eudora Welty Fellowship, and a Resident Artist Scholarship to the Chalitna Lodge Creative Residency Program. Last year, she won the University Research Council Graduate Student Stipend and Research Cost Program for faculty-student collaboration. Fiction Fellowship recipient Megan Pillow is a graduate of the University of Iowa Writers Workshop in fiction and holds a PhD in English from the University of Kentucky. She is project manager for Roxane Gay and co-editor of The Audacity, Dr. Gay's newsletter. Her work has appeared in, among other places, Electric Literature, Smoke Long Quarterly, The Believer, Guernica, Long Reads, and The Best American Mystery and Suspense 2022. She lives in Louisville with her two children. And Poetry Fellowship recipient Lisa Williams has published 3 books of poems. She teaches at Centre College and serves as series editor for the University Press of Kentucky New Poetry and Prose series. She has poems forthcoming in Image and on terrain.org. So welcome to all of you. I'd like to start out with Lisa, and I'd like to ask you a very general question. Where do you write? What is your writing space?
That's a wonderful question. It's a little complicated right now. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and there's not a lot of space for for the writing in the household. But with poems, I feel as if I can write those in lots of different spaces, and so I wouldn't say that I have at this point in my life a dedicated space for writing poems. So sometimes it might be, sketching out a draft. I don't even know how I write these poems because I have written a lot of new poems and I don't know when they got written. I don't know if anyone else ever has that experience. I'm sure fiction writers don't because it's so much work. But I feel like I'm able to sort of get these poems written in between spaces and other activities. So that is kind of an answer.
All right. Jeremy, can you talk a little bit with us about what drives you to write?
Yeah, I don't know what I would do with my time if I didn't do creative things between making music and writing. If I don't do one or both of those pretty regularly, I start to feel that in the same way that I feel like I need exercise. If I don't exercise for several days, it is very much a need. Um, One of the questions that was posed ahead of time was just how did we start doing this? And I thought about it, and I think for me it comes from being a kid and just making up stories for action figures. I would spend hours doing that, and maybe it was a 45-minute chunk of time in reality, but when I look back on it now, it seems like I would spend half a day making up these stories. And I think that's just continued to live in me throughout my life. Is just um, yeah, just a need to probably to be outside of myself and exist in someone else's experience, or to just understand life through a different lens. Um, I've certainly spent a lot of my life escaping from myself, and so I think music and books that those all have contributed to just a broader view of what life is about.
Thank you. Haley, can you talk off off camera? We were talking a little bit earlier about influences. Can you share with us some what are your influences and what's your inspiration?
Yeah. A lot of those. Lisa Williams right here. She really, all I knew was that I really liked words when I went to center, and Lisa's poetry, it's hard to describe, but it just really brought me into the fold of language. I feel like, and that's a lot of my just playing with the music of words and what words are next to each other, and when words are near one another, how they communicate with one another. That's that was all very much Lisa Williams's influence, and so it's very exciting to be here with her. And then a lot of Kentucky writers, Crystal Wilkinson and Frank X. Walker, very important to me. Writing about one's community with authority and without apology. I think that's something that Crystal Wilkinson has. I've never met her, but from reading her, just like imparted. And then some of the bigger names, like the names that people often reference. Virginia Woolf was really influential on me. I think it was, I don't know, just like I think something I had to learn was to stop apologizing and to just like write about what it is that I wanted to write about. And Virginia Woolf is very much like, this is my book and I'm going to do what I want. And it doesn't look like your book, and because it's mine. And I found that very empowering. Susan Choi, I think, does that as well. There's just James Baldwin. I would be remiss not to mention him. It's a lot of like, this is my book and I'm going to do whatever I want. And then a lot of moral clarity that I find very inspiring. I mean, I could just go on and on. Writers are amazing. And I feel like they all have taught me and taught us a lot.
It's interesting, and I kind of want to continue in that path, because it sounds like you're talking about this journey to discover your voice as a writer. Joanna, what has that journey, or what was that journey like for you?
Oh, that's a great question. And it has been a long one and an ongoing one, I would even say. And I'm happy to follow up Haley's answer too, because I know you mentioned Virginia Woolf, and I think she is someone for me who has also been sort of instrumental in shaping my voice in that same way that you were just discussing, Haley. And I feel like I can't quite answer this without nodding to so many of the inspirations I have turned to over the years. So I think in that sense, there are so many poets whom I've read, especially when I was first starting to read poetry, even as a teenager, and I sort of realized for the first time, like, oh, this is a thing I can do. This isn't just some outside world that I don't know how to get into. It's like, oh, you can read this and you can write it. So I think some poets that I've been reading lately who have helped shape my voice are I mean, we mentioned Kentucky. There's Ada Limon, of course, our, great US poet laureate, who's also a Kentuckian. But I've also been reading like Rebecca Gale Howe, and Alicia Sotelo, Paige Lewis, and Karina McGlynn. There are just so many poets whom I think are really approaching poetry with a sense of play, and sort of similar to Virginia Woolf, and what we were saying before. Like, I turn to these poets and see them doing new creative, or sort of approaching poetry with a new creative take. And it's helped me realize that, like, when I sit down to write, I don't need to be aiming to write something specific. The whole point is to sort of have fun and be able to play with the words and play with what I'm doing, and to just be able to have fun with the process. And I think that's one of the biggest keys to unlocking voice and finding voice, is just sort of letting all those other guards down, and sit down and realize, like, this is for me. The writing is for me, and it's fun, and have fun with it. And sort of a meandering answer, but and I'll also say too, even in finding voice, I've turned to non-writers also for a lot of inspiration, which is why I think in so much of my poetry, especially this project that I submitted for this, I write about a lot of pop culture icons over the years. So even in that way, being able to turn to artists, whose work is across other mediums, has also sort of opened up new opportunities for exploring voice.
Thank you. And it's okay to meander. That's why we're here today. Megan, you mentioned something off camera before we started that prompts me to want to ask this question. What describe how do you negotiate work-life balance as a writer? I feel in myself, at least for myself, I have a finite number of words each day that I can do, and if I've gotten to the end of the workday, I can't do any writing at home because I've run out. But so how do you negotiate that?
I feel like I don't know if I got lucky or if I created a problem for myself during my PhD program, but I had, I started my program with a 1-year-old, and I had my second child while I was completing my PhD. And so I had to figure out how to do that. And for me, my creative work was a necessary outlet from the scholarly work that I was doing day in and day out in my program, and the teaching that I was doing. So I became a night owl, and I got a lot of work done after my kids were in bed. Between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. became like my prime work time, which I know is not entirely the healthiest way, but I kind of had to do what I had to do to get through. Now obviously that I'm done with my PhD and I have a job that is remote and flexible, and I have my kids half time now. It has given me a little bit more flexibility, but I have continued to try to kind of maximize my time for work. So I'm still a night owl, but I don't stay up till 3 a.m. anymore. I usually kind of top out at like 12:30 or 1. But for me, that is when I often do my writing. I write late at night. The book that I am nearly done with now, I'm in the home stretch with it, with my novel. It has been written almost entirely at night because that's the time that I have. And I do carve out when I don't have my children. I carve out time on the weekends. But because of the nature of my work, it's very project based. So it is changing almost daily. My deadlines are sometimes very short and sometimes very long. So sometimes I'm also able to work in writing time in between those particular project responsibilities. So sometimes it means that I have to shift, right? Sometimes I'm writing in the morning and working on a project at night, depending on what's happening. Like, for example, tonight, we have a book club meeting online, a Zoom at 7 p.m. So I will have that time plotted out for work, and then I'll probably do a little bit of writing before or after. So for me, it has been about being flexible. And also, this is something I tell students a lot. I'm running a program right now called Craft Year, where I have about 10 students who haven't been able to do a traditional MFA, and I'm doing just a free writing workshop for them this year. And what I've said to them is be gentle with yourself and try to be consistent. So those two things in combination. Some days I only write a sentence, right? That's all that I have time to get down. But after 6 months, after a year, if you try to come back to it, 2 or 3 times a week, you end up with a lot of words. You end up with a lot of material that you've produced. And you're also not beating yourself up about not being a writer who's sitting down and writing 4 hours a day. So yeah, I would say flexibility and being gentle with yourself and being consistent is the only way that I get my work done.
Well, you mentioned the when that you write, and I think that's fascinating. So I'd like to open it up to the rest of the panel. I wasn't going to do this, ask all of you the same question, but I think it's a fascinating topic to explore. When do you write? And let's start off with Jeremy.
Yeah, so I'm a morning writer for sure. Sometimes I will do some stuff in the afternoon. I was joking with Tamara earlier. I'm a musician, so I'm supposed to be a night owl, but that is absolutely not the case. I grew up on a farm, and so I've got very much that Protestant work ethic, wake up with the chickens kind of thing. So I write early. My work schedule generally, I don't start seeing, I'm a therapist, so I don't start seeing clients until generally about 11 a.m. So I've usually got a chunk of time in the mornings, and I'm fully caffeinated, so that is my prime time to be trying to create something.
Haley, what about you? When do you write?
Typically mornings. I also, that's like when my brain is at its highest function. It's when I can like focus. My house is quiet. Then my partner and my dogs sleep in. So it's kind of, but I'm really interested in what Megan was talking about with flexibility, because I very recently that started to shift. I don't know why, but I'm not, my hours are not my prime hours anymore. And I'm starting to panic because when you have, I don't know, when you have your routine, when you've had what works for you for so long, and I don't know, I mean, I don't know. You mentioned having kids and difficult high work volume times kind of taught you that flexibility. And I'm just curious also, and we can get to this later, but about your process and how else you approach it. This is the last thing I'll say, but this project that I've been working on, sometimes characters surprise you, and there are 2 serial killers who have appeared in my novel, and I'm really upset about it. I don't like true crime. I don't want, this is not, it's not my genre at all. I'm what are you doing here? And I'm afraid that, and it's Halloween. I'm are you gonna make me write at night? Anyway, that's a longer story. But after we talk about all that, Megan, I'd love to hear more about your process.
And
I'm
Lisa,
going to jump in just real quick. Is it okay,
sure.
Tom, if I jump in real quick?
Please do.
I just want to say something about what you said. First of all, I always find that when your characters surprise you, that is often a sign that you are really on to something promising. So even though you may not like your serial killers being in there, I think that it's a sign that you're on to something really interesting. And I found the same thing with the book that I'm working on. There are many characters who have turned up out of nowhere that I did not expect. I think it's hard. I think especially in the academy, we are taught in certain ways to be very regimented about our time, and that is somehow a sign of our dedication, right, to our work. And I think this applies actually more broadly, not just in the academy, but in many, in publishing. I think it's consistent there too. There are lots of places where we see this kind of message that is being sent out to us. And I actually think learning that flexibility and giving yourself the license to go with it, and because what it's doing is it is giving you the ability to work under different conditions that you were working before, right? That is an advantage. That's going to be an advantage as you decide whatever you want to do after your PhD. It is scary at first. I remember the first time that my work patterns began to shift, and I was like, what is happening? Like, I've been working this way for years, right? But I do think that that flexibility, it gives you this understanding of yourself and this ability to work in ways that you may not have been able to before. And that way, as conditions change in your life, you become a bit more adaptable to the ways in which life is just going to change. Like, that's the only constant, I think, other than death and taxes, is the change that we're all going to face. So we can talk more about that down the road. I don't want to monopolize this, but those are just some of my initial thoughts about that. And I look forward to reading about the serial killers.
I have written down the word surprise as a prompt for myself for later if we have time to explore. But Lisa, what is your ideal time for writing?
Well, I guess it's more of a state of being, and I have less of that than I used to, as I had published. Well, the third book was in production before my daughter was born. And so it's been a 10-year shifting and sort of trying to figure out, well, when am I going to do this? As I say, I've written a lot of poems. I'm not sure exactly when or where they've gotten written. They've gotten published. But I think it's sort of a matter of energy. And I tend to write in response to a certain sort of opening of energy, inspiration. I know we don't, maybe that's a word that we don't necessarily want to use, but because I write so much about nature, and sort of the structures and the processes of nature, it really depends upon having time to be looking at things, to be observing, to be sort of in the field, or to be doing research, and then allow for the words to kind of emerge out of that. So I guess I carry the energy and the words and the process with me kind of in my head. And then when I have a chance to scribble things down, I will do that. And that might be at 9 o'clock at night, after my family are all asleep, that sort of a thing. But I can relate to what everybody's talking about. And I think it's wonderful to have time and to even remember those times when you could sit at your desk for 3 or 4 hours and just, I would be so obsessed with poems when I was younger, that even when I was teaching you, Haley, I mean, I would just get like glued to my seat and just not like leave to get water or anything, and that's a very passionate moment in life when you're doing that. And I'm not really at that place anymore, which I don't see as a bad thing, but it's just it's a difference now. It's not, my life isn't so much about me anymore. So if that's another meandering answer, but I love meandering, so I hope that's okay.
Just fine.
Mm-hmm.
And Joanna, do you have a favorite time of day in which you like to write?
I mean, well, sort of, yes. But I am going to say that, like, for me, it's a combination of what everyone has sort of been saying. I think being flexible with writing time is key for me. And then also giving into those moments when you do get sort of that state of mind, like you were just saying, Lisa. And for me, I do tend to write a lot at night. And I think that's just a matter of when I sort of have the time to sit down and, sort of stretch my thoughts and actually work with different writing ideas. But it is interesting because, like so many have said, growing up, you always heard like, oh, there are these great professional writers and they have this regimen where they'll sit down from, X hour till X hour and just write. And I think for the longest time, I thought, oh, am I not like a real writer because I'm not doing that? And I think letting go of that sort of idea that that's how it has to be is what has really enabled me to actually write more and to not beat myself up for, if I don't sit down to write for 2 hours a day. I do try to write regularly, but I also acknowledge, like at this point in my life, like there are times where I'm writing more and times where I'm writing less, but I'm comfortable now knowing that no matter what, I'll always return to the writing. And I think allowing that to structure how I write, and still, of course, making myself write even when I don't feel like it, but I have the time. I think that's really helped me write a lot more. But like Meg said, I do write the most at night. And for me, I think that's just when I'm kind of like done with the day and I'm not thinking as much about other things in life, and I'm able to just sort of truly let my brain wander and focus on what I'm doing. So that's when I sit down and accomplish the most. But of course, there are thoughts and ideas that will come at random times. So I have so many notes in my phone, that are the results of laying down and about to fall asleep and thinking, oh, I need to jot this down before I forget it, or being, driving on the road and having to pull over to write something down. So those things do hit sort of sporadically when you're not thinking about it. But at night is when I do find myself writing the most. But at the same time, it's whenever I can get the time and space for quiet and being able to do that. So coming back to the whole idea of it being flexible, I think that's really the key for me.
It's so inconvenient when you can't jot it down. I try to carry a notebook with me wherever, but right now I'd like to ask you to we'll go through, and we'd like to have some readings from you. So if it's okay, can we start with Jeremy?
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to slide out of the way. I've got Lee here who's going to function as my reader because I'm visually impaired, and that's not easy for me to pull off. But I'll quickly introduce the piece. So what she's going to read is essentially the very first paragraph from the memoir I've written, followed by a flashback that takes place in chapter 1. In the flashback, I'm 10 years old and I've been to the eye specialist for the first time. So what someone would take from the novel is clearly early in my life, as my vision was starting to get bad, I didn't get any clarification or guidance about what was going on and what was happening to me. So for a kid who already had a vivid imagination, that left a lot of space in my world that I filled with just utter terror, just fear. So there's also sort of a Halloween theme in what she's going to read. So I thought it was appropriate for today. So, and just to clarify too, like when the book starts, things in my life were very, very bleak. And so you'll hear that in what she's going to share. But I'm going to slide out of the way, and Lee's going to present a brief reading. So.
Going blind is like disappearing. You stand on stage, helpless, watching as the lights on your one big show come down and fade to black. You reach out to touch. You breathe deeply, taste the air around you. You strain to hear the sounds of belonging and find you are alone. The audience is not going away. The world is not going away. You are. Here you go, Jeremy, for the sunlight. See, they unroll like this. The nurse hands me a dark roll of plastic, a neatly wound pair of disposable sunglasses with cardboard arms. My parents lead me out as I place the sunglasses around one ear and then the other. Fighting to return to their version of the fetal position, I have to hold the glasses flat against the space between my eyes as I finish rolling them out and over my eye. Okay, Jeremy, I'll see you next year, the doctor says, as we single file out of his office. Give us a call if there's any big change before then, he says to my parents, turning back to his next victim. Thank you, my parents say in unison. Thank you? This doesn't seem like a thank you situation. I want an apology. Sorry for torturing your son all morning. Sorry for the bad news. Sorry your kid's life is permanently fucked. The dreams came after that. Maybe that night. 2 reoccurring nightmares that would follow me for years to come. One was your standard falling dream. Somehow I end up on the edge of a cliff, like Wile E. Coyote, led astray by the faster, smarter roadrunner. I plunge down and down, waiting for the bottom, wishing for the bottom, as the fall lasts longer than physics should allow. Then, just before impact, I wake up, sitting up in my bed and looking around the dark room, wild-eyed. The second dream was worse. I lay paralyzed, flat on my back, as a figure slowly comes into view. Dressed in the only version of vampire attire I'm aware of at the time, my assailant looks a lot like the Count from Sesame Street, or Count Chocula of sugary breakfast cereal fame. Pale of skin, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead, the vampire wears a high-collared cape in black. He bends toward me. I can't move. I can't scream. As the vampire's mouth opens, fangs change his placid, childlike face to the definition of evil. I fight to escape, squirm and wriggle with growing ferocity as fangs draw closer. Red lips, the color of blood, frame bright white teeth bound for my neck. Will they tear me to shreds, leaving me to bleed out in my bed? Or will they turn me? Am I next to be a monster, damned to roam the wide world forever in misery? At last, the physical reaction of racing heart and shallow breathing are more than sleep can contain. A cold sweat hugs me as I lay in terror, unable to close my eyes. I search the dark with all my senses, feeling for any shift in the air that might give away the presence of another creature in my room. Ears prick up like an animal on alert. I scan, sonar searching for the threat surrounding me. For years, these 2 versions of my terror would return. When anxiety spiked, they would haunt my nights as I ignored my fear of the future by day. And eventually they went away. With time, I outgrew the physical manifestations of fear a child's mind will create, but a fear that consumes, a fear that hangs over all aspects of your life, a fear that demands space among every second of every day of a life that has barely begun, will not go quietly into the night. Count Chocula was very much alive.
Thank you for that. We appreciate the reading. Let's now turn to one of our poets, and Lisa, why don't you share a reading with us?
Okay, so the first poem, this is from a manuscript that's, I'm not really sure what the title is at this point. So this poem is called Soil Horizon. And I want to say that the first line is responding to the poem by Wordsworth, When the World is Too Much with Me Late and Soon. And so it sort of I didn't necessarily intend this, but it has an echo of that, and then it goes in a different direction. It is a sonnet. Soil horizon. When the world is with me nonstop, without sun, I think about what's underneath that drags and turns, milky and limbless, in one long, concurrent rippling through Earth's skin. Millions and millions of them, tons invisible to speech, above the bedrock, faults, and sediment, nudging strata out of stone, casting hard path into warm accommodation, mess that for them is breath and fruit and duty and waves of lengthening like a slower, more deliberating ocean. Yes, I think of the bodies of the worms, their halls of soil opening and their permeating ways, all knowledge that is density in motion.
Thank you, Lisa. And let's now hear from Megan, please.
Okay, thank you. I'll just give you a brief introduction. This is, I'm going to read from the prologue of my novel in progress, and it is, I'm actually calling it a mosaic novel. It's a novel in short stories. And I got that term from Sequoia Nagamatsu, who used that in an interview about his collection that came out last year, How High We Go in the Dark, which is wonderful. But it was the first collection that gave me a way of thinking about how to make the short story that appeared in Best American Mystery and Suspense into a novel. Rather than exploding the story out, I have built all these stories in the same world as that short story. And so there are several characters who thread through all of those stories. So what this prologue does, my intention is to set the tone, the atmosphere, but also to give people a brief introduction to the characters who are going to make their appearance and are going to be most important as the book moves forward. So this is just a couple of pages long, so I'll read this for you all. And the novel is carrying the same title as the short story. So the novel is called Long Live the Girl Detective. This is called At the End Somewhere. We begin not in the beginning, but at the end somewhere. It is the cusp of night, that little sliver of light between blue, black, and black, and the air holds its bit of chill, like the skin of a patient etherized upon a table. Look there in the eve of every roof of every house, a bird tucks itself in around its babies. Tomorrow the babies will be tossed from the nest like rocks, but tonight their mother holds them close. Look, in the corner of every house, on the cusp of every place a person tries to make a home, someone is tightening a sheet like a noose. Someone is tucking a blanket around themselves. Look at the glimmer of lights on the roadways, the glitter of stars on the water. Look at the way the parents' chests ease as the eyes of the children fall closed. Look at the way the chests of the women tighten as the men who hurt and hunt them down make their way home. Look at the dip and the dart of the fireflies at the edge of the lawns, the dip and dart of the tongues of the lovers who consume each other in hotel beds and in the backs of cars. Look at the tip-top of every tip-top tree where the godmothers prepare themselves for sleeping, where the last of the green grays out to shadow, where the last of the blue dims down to black. Night has come. It is night now in every city and town and empty field in America. Above us in the sky, a droning. In a nursing home in Arizona, a woman lights her forbidden cigarette in the dark and blows out a perfect ring out of her window. She taps her cigarette, tips her chin at the sound. On a dock on the outskirts of Boca Chica Key, a woman sits and sips a glass of wine. She listens to the laps of the waves against the wooden pilings, and it conjures an unsettling memory, an unsettling sound. The pale nude body of the woman, the sound her feet made against the concrete, the sound of her lurching through the streets of that small town, the sound. And the silence between the lapping, the droning. It too stands the hairs on her arms on end. In a field in Illinois where a school once stood, a group of children hear it too. They stop their endless playing and they lift their eyes to the sky. In the streets of River Heights, streets still awash with flooding, a dog who was once a woman is stretching the body that is her new home. She hears the sound above her. The sound surrounds her. She is the sound, and she lifts her howling voice to meet it. In the living rooms and bathrooms of River Heights, around the smoking coals of River Heights' backyard grills, the men who were once animals stop their blustering. They hear the sound, and they lift their bottles of beer to their lips. They try to keep their hands from quivering. In the close, warm blackness of their house, Bess and George hear it. They press and turn the bedclothes between their hands like dough. In the orange light of her kitchen, the girl detective eats banana bread bite by bite in that golden glow. She brushes the cum from her cheek. She hears a tapping at her window. There, an eclipse of sunset-colored moths are gathering. She puts a finger to her lips as if to say, hush, the children are sleeping. Hush, the others are not prepared. High in the stretch of sky above America, not the chatter, not the thrum, not the ho-hum roar, but a whir, a whir, a whir. High in the stretch of sky above America, the godmothers lift their leafy heads from slumber and think of what is past and what is coming. It is night in America. It is dark now in every alley and every cul-de-sac and every single prison cell. Darkness blankets the mothers rocking their babies to sleep. Darkness climbs the back of the white men crossing the threshold of nightclubs with guns. Darkness curls around the corners of the houses where the children make Lego animals and the teenagers make Garfield anime memes. Darkness like a palm atop the billionaires and their market divinations, atop the influencers and their glittering porcelain teeth. Darkness across everything and everyone. And in the darkness, the sound of a great door opening, a release, like a flock of 100,000 birds lifting their wings in flight. Something has let loose across the sky. Something is fluttering down and going to seed across the ending of our story. Strange things afoot, and stranger. And because time is nothing more than beads on a string, we must sift back through them slowly to make sense of it. So pick a page, put your finger there, prepare yourself to slip within. Hush now, watch, and listen. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And those of you that have shared some readings, we appreciate that. We're going to move back into some questions, but we will get to readings from Haley and Joanna a little bit later. Before I launch into my own question, as my colleague Sarah Schmidt has indicated in the chat, you should feel free to write questions of your own in the chat. If we can get to them, we will feed them to the panel of writers that we have here and get some answers for you. But right now, I want to return to that word surprise that I had written down, that Haley had mentioned in her remarks earlier, about being surprised sometimes by characters that she has conceived on the page. And I'd like to direct this to the two poets among us. So Lisa and Joanna, have you ever, even if you're maybe not creating characters, have you ever been surprised from anything that you've written that has given you pause, and either pleasantly or unpleasantly, in the process of writing?
Sure, I'll go ahead and jump in on this one. The answer is absolutely yes. And more often than not, those wind up being the pieces and the directions to go in that are like, I cherish those pieces the most in the end. I would say, sure, there are a few poems that, I'll sit down and sort of run through a draft and then come back and edit lightly, and those are done. But that is far more rare than the poems I write that grow over time and with surprising twists and turns. I would say most often, and to speak a little to my process and how surprise comes into that, most often I'll start out with a few lines and sort of build from there. But over time, I also wind up compiling like, I don't know, 40 or 50 pages of just sort of free writing, thoughts for different poems. And then I'll let those sit for, a couple months and come back and revisit them. And I wind up printing all of those pages out and sort of moving my coffee table to make space and like spread them out on the floor, and realize that like I'll even bring out scissors and cut pieces apart and like reorganize. And one of the things that I'm always surprised by then is how one poem I thought I started actually connects to a totally another piece that I started doing. And I realize how those bridge together and create something entirely new. And that is always surprising and something I've had to learn to let myself trust will happen if I come back and like revisit things. And I think that's also sort of the most satisfying points of writing, when you realize like, oh, this is something totally other than what I thought set out thinking it would be. So yes, I definitely encounter surprises in writing and actually hope for them.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I don't know where my poems are going to go when I begin them. And I know that sounds very odd, because at least many of my students, it sounds odd because they're used to trying to be in control, sort of knowing what they are going to say and thinking they know what they're going to say. And so I feel like knowing and knowledge for me is found through motion, through thinking, through turning over and over. And I don't, and so poems are always a surprise, like they always are. So so they'll begin maybe with something vague, like I'm really interested in worms, right? Like that last poem, or just what's happening under the earth, and so how essential that stuff is to the whole planet, and just like what is it like to kind of like imagine yourself into that space and what's going on down there, right? And sort of writing about that. And then maybe the sounds will start circling up, and I'll get caught on those sounds, and they'll kind of guide me through to some sort of thought, or I don't want to say conclusion, but maybe a conclusion that I wasn't aware I was going to arrive at. And I think that one of the wonderful things about poems in general, allowing yourself the space and time, and it really is a privilege to have the space and time to write a poem, I recognize that, is that it gives us a space for really thinking, right? And thinking on the page, and figuring things out. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that Emily Dickinson has always been a big influence on me, at least since my late 20s, early 30s. And I always had the sense with her that her poems were so strange that she followed her thoughts on the page, kind of wherever they went. And I feel like there's so much optimism and confidence and wonderful strangeness in that, to say, I'm going to follow where my thinking goes, and I'm not going to just compose a thought and then create a poem that kind of affirms that thought, right? And so again, that's a meandering answer, but yes, I'm always surprised. I didn't know in that poem that I just read, we probably can't remember it now because there's lots of other words that have been used, but all knowledge that is density and motion, like I had no idea that was going to come up, but I kind of ended up liking it, so yeah, that's my answer. I love surprise.
Thank you, Lisa. And Jeremy, I know creative nonfiction is a different animal, I realize, because generally you you know what's going to happen in the story because you're recounting actual events. But is there room for surprise in that? And have you experienced it? And if so, how?
Yeah, so I've since I wrote this memoir, I've repeatedly said to people that even though I have a master's degree in mental health counseling, and when you're doing that kind of graduate study, you spend 2 years doing a lot of self analysis so that you can turn around and help people through their own psychological, emotional journeys. And so, despite spending those 2 years really thinking about, well, why am I the way I am? And why did the mistakes of my past happen? What did I contribute to that? Writing the memoir is the single greatest self exploration experience of my life. There was a lot in my own history that I had misinterpreted over the years, or I had a certain spin on events had developed. So as I'm writing that memoir, I spent a lot of time um, looking back on things that I had characterized in one frame and putting them and realizing that they really belonged in a different frame. It gave me a lot more empathy for my parents and other people. I don't think anybody who had a kid with my circumstances where I grew up would have been well equipped to support that kid. I mean, that's just honest. I don't think most people would have known what to do to help a kid with my circumstances. So, so there were a lot of surprises as I looked back on experiences that I lived firsthand because years have passed and you have a better understanding of what was really going on there for me and for other people involved. And that's the greatest thing about writing to me is it gives us it's an exploration of empathy, and sometimes that's empathy for ourselves and often for the characters we're creating. But I mean, that's what I feel like that's what my whole life is trying to be about. My professional work, my writing, everything is about understanding. And yeah, so tons of surprises for sure.
Thank you, Jeremy. We have a question in the chat, and I'm gonna field it toward the fiction writers among us. Have you ever experienced a character who will not behave as you want them to behave? Megan, let's hear from you on that one.
I absolutely have. I have that in my work right now, and I very much in the past, early on when I was starting as a fiction writer, it was kind of like WWE. Like I would try to wrestle them into compliance. Like I would not like the fact that they were veering off of the course that I had set for them, and I would try to make them behave. And it did not work. It did not work for me. Some people are able to do that, I think, but for me, the writing felt very stiff. It felt like I was trying to control the narrative a bit too much. And so I try to look at my characters as for that time as the friends that I am traveling with. And so it's kind of like if you have a friend who out of the blue says, oh, hey, we weren't going to plan on going to this party, but let's just go to this party. Okay. And I'm not great at doing that in real life, being that spontaneous in real life. So with my characters, I try to say, okay, let's go. Let's see where this is going to go. We can always extricate ourselves if there's a problem, right? But oftentimes it leads to the most like interesting scenes and interactions if I just kind of follow that path a little bit, because I always tell myself you can go back from that. Whatever you write down does not have to be final. I actually keep for every piece that I'm working on, no matter how big or small, whether it's a flash piece or whether it's a novel, I have a document that is an outtakes document. And if I don't like something, I take it out. I never delete anything. I just take it out and drop it into that document, usually with like a header for the chapter, or the place in the text where it came from, so that I'll end up sometimes with 20, 50 pages of outtakes that I then can kind of, what do they call them? The military calls them hangar deck queens, those planes that they keep just for scraps. I think of my outtake files like that. And so I always think any adventure that a character goes on, maybe it's for something else. Maybe it's intended for a different piece or for later in the piece. But I try now to just give in and let it go and see what happens.
Haley, how about you? Do you wrestle them? Do you schmooze them? How do you treat those characters?
Yeah, it's so much parallels what Megan just said. I have the same document, and I call it.
Uh-oh, it looks like we lost Haley for a moment. Hopefully she comes back and rejoins us. My colleague Sarah, will you keep an eye on that, Sarah and or Tamara? Thank you. So I'm anxious to hear what Haley has to say on that topic, but in the meantime, I will ask well, here's a good question. For all of you, who are you reading right now? And we'll start with Joanna.
Oh yeah, I love that question. And it's funny because right now I don't have a poetry book in the mix. This week I'm actually reading, it's like the 75th anniversary edition of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, and those collected stories felt appropriate for this this week. And those have been really fun and surprising, full of surprises, I'd say. And then I'm also reading the novel Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. And I think right now I have Gabrielle Bates' Judas Goat, the poetry collection, on top of my next to be read poetry stack. So I'll be getting to that soon.
All right. Lisa, who are you reading right now?
I'm sort of going back and forth. I do read a lot of contemporary fiction. So I'm reading Layla Slimani's new book. And I'm also reading, it's called Watch Us Dance. I think is that the name? I was looking at my and I'm also, Annie Ernaux has been in the news a lot. I mean, over the last year or two, I love her fiction. I've read everything, and her nonfiction, her autofiction. I'm reading a book by a philosopher of science called Peter Godfrey, or his name is Peter Godfrey Smith, and he's written a book called The Mind of an Octopus. And he writes a lot about explorations of how subjectivity developed in humans, but also in animals, and sort of looking at different kinds of creatures in terms of their individuality and their subjectivity and what's that like, because I do write a lot about marine animals and marine life, and so I'm looking at that, and then a couple of other things, a book about the woman who discovered the continental drift, and another book about a woman who created the first aquarium to study living marine creatures. So all that stuff.
How about you, Jeremy?
Earlier this year, I read Anthony Doerr's Cloud Cuckoo Land. And since I'm also a musician, I took on this really interesting exercise of writing songs based on all the characters in that book. I actually read that book and then immediately picked it up and read it again. I've never really done that back to back, but that is an absolutely gorgeous piece of work. And then I've moved into fiction now, so I've written a speculative novel, and I'm my next project I think is going to be this strange mashup of like a climate disaster murder mystery thing. So I've been reading. I've got some Tana French that I read earlier this year, and another novel of hers queued up, and I've read a couple of books from Eowyn Ivy. Her book, The Light at the Edge of the World, is really gorgeous, set in Alaska in the late 1800s, and has some really beautiful magical elements to it. So that's it's for me, it's a constant mix of this and that, and wherever my attention lies at the moment. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeremy, and welcome back, Haley. It's good to see you again. Somebody mentioned in the chat that it was an apropos use of suspense as a literary device. So, we were just talking about and I'll get back to the question that you were attempting to answer before we lost you, but we were talking about who are we reading right now. So why don't you, what's on your nightstand? Or what are you reading, or who are you reading?
He was last year I read the Eowyn Ivy novel that you were just talking about, Jeremy. It's incredible. It's so beautiful. Yeah, recommend that to all. What I'm reading right now, I'm doing a lot of research for my novel. So it's a lot of Kentucky history, Kentucky lore, and diaries, letters. I read a lot of Eudora Welty over the summer for that fellowship, and I got to be very nosy and read her family papers, and so a lot of letters written by her mother. But yeah, just it's a lot of historical documents right now. I recently reread Crystal Wilkinson's The Birds of Opulence, and before that I read Homegoing for the first time, and it's a gorgeous novel.
Thank you. And now to return to the question you were attempting to answer about have characters that you created ever not behaved the way you wanted them to, and what did you do about it?
Yeah, I think so my computer died while it was plugged in. And I think that's also apropos of what my characters do to me so often. Not that they don't usually surprise die on me, but they do just really throw me pretty big curveballs. And I mentioned earlier, yeah, 2 serial killers arrived, and I'm still kind of salty about it because I don't like the horror genre. Is just like not for me. I couldn't watch Game of Thrones because it was just too sad. Like everyone, and anyway, it's just like it's really not where I live, and so just the fact that they arrived really surprised me. But it's even the characters that I named and planned, they almost never do what I invented them to do. They kind of do their own thing, and I love how Megan talked about spontaneity and thinking about her characters as friends. I tend to think of them as children in the sort. I'm not a parent, but in terms of inventing something that didn't do what you invented it to do, I threw my parents a lot of curveballs, and I continue to. And I think in the more painful eras, I've had a lot of questions of just like, why did you make me if you only wanted me to do like a certain thing? If you only wanted, why have kids if you wanted a certain type of kid? Like, don't you want to get to know me? And so that's like, this is a boring conversation for me to have with my therapist, but that's how I've learned to be more open-minded with my characters, of just like, okay, I invented this being, and I'm looking for truth. I'm looking for answers. And I want to see, I'm going to remain open to who they show me they are. And I know that they're technically inventions of my own mind. I don't really understand how that works, but they're always surprising me.
Haley, I wanted to remind you about the John C. Young that you did at Center. This is a interdisciplinary what is it, like a scholarship that they get to do independent study work on 2 different fields. And Haley did creative writing and psychology, focusing on psychopathy. Do you remember this? Psychopathy or psychopathy? So I just was saying that, like, I just was thinking that you have had this research and this interest as part of your creative work that goes way back. You probably do remember that, but it seems like it's related to the serial killers that popped up, maybe. I don't know.
I completely forgot that psychopathy was a part of that. Like,
Yeah.
of course, I remember the poems I wrote, and I remember structuring them, because that was a really challenging part. And I've been drawing on that experience a little bit lately. And sorry, my dogs are awake now. But I forgot until just now that was, the human mind is so frustrating. Thank you for reminding me of that, Lisa. I'm gonna have to dig that back up and see what I was trying to tell myself, or what I have to teach myself now, even if I don't want to learn it.
Well, Lisa, somewhat related to that, I want to ask you this question. You had remarked in your response to what you're reading that you're doing some research. I think specifically some marine biology research. I think sometimes, especially young readers, are reading things, and they think that the authors just have this intuitive knowledge about the things they're writing about. Why is it so important, you think, to do that research into what you intend to write, especially if it's a work of fiction or poetry? Why do we do that?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm teaching a creative writing on nature and the environment class right now. And, I don't, when I started writing about nature and being inspired by nature as a writer, I began in a much more abstract, mythic mode of responding to it, like this tree and that landscape. And I guess as I've progressed, I think as a writer and poet, I recognize that this learning more, observing more, detailing the specific processes and qualities and features of these other organisms and of this world around me is how I can really honor and have respect for the life around me. And so it seems to me like I'm not saying, anyone's bad for doing this, but it seems to me to be sort of a very self-centered way of approaching the world if you are not really attending to what else is there, and trying to come as close to what it's like to be that other thing or person or plant as you can. And of course, we're doing this in language, and we have names for these things which we've given them. And so all of this is so kind of contrived in a way, but we can still do the work of trying to come closer to those lives and those things outside of ourselves. And I know that Roxane Gay has written some really smart things about writing across difference. And so I guess I think of that as not just kinds of people, right, but also organisms and lives. And does that make sense? And so the research that I do a lot of reading. I don't deep sea dive. I wish I did, but I have to read the experiences of the people who have. I'm disappointed that I'm not a marine biologist, right? But so I do what I can in the way that I can, if that makes sense, to learn more. And I try not to beat myself up for not being the person who can fully immerse myself in that experience. I do what I can with who I am.
It sounds like you're saying it helps with the whole process of word painting, being able to illustrate, as opposed to saying, there's a tree over there, what kind of tree, what are the leaves like, what's the bark like, stuff like that.
Yeah, and even more so, like I find more and more like learning about, photosynthesis, or learning about the different layers of cells. Like, just the more I have, at least historically in my history, explored how things work. I worked for an environmental consultant for a number of years too. So like I'm I'm just very kind of steeped in this notion of we can learn so much from the processes and the growths, the natural processes of, the natural world. And so I want to learn more about how to be a better human from studying these things. So it's not only about illustrating or about the visual, it's about all of those different layers. Whereas I think earlier in my career it would have been more about the description, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that makes sense. It all seems very, out there to me, but
Well,
it's complicated.
I think research is important. Joanna, I'd like to ask you, when you need to go somewhere for inspiration, where do you go?
Oh, that is a great question. I guess if I'm intentionally like trying to seek out inspiration, um, specifically for poetry, of course, I turn to the poetry books that I admire and that really get me thinking like, oh, okay, I'm in the mindset. I want to write and do this. But if I'm thinking, or if I'm looking for inspiration regarding what to write about, I find that I have to go to art forms and mediums other than writing a lot of times, just to really get me thinking, which is why in so much of this poetry manuscript, I'm like watching live performances of musicians I like. I'm turning to paintings that are really inspiring, because I feel like those sort of act as then a springboard for being able to play with my own words and apply words to those inspirations. So I think like specifically, I do turn a lot to music, and even in my book, I talk about like FKH Biggs, who is an artist I really admire, and Fiona Apple, and then I do turn to other writers that are, again, sort of outside of the genre I'm writing in. So I have poems inspired by Lauren Groff, who is a novelist and, fiction writer I know and love. And like Leonora Carrington, writer, painter, multimedia, like artist with a capital A. So that's what I really try to turn to is art that is outside of my form to really, really get the juices flowing.
And since we've got you on, do you have some writing you'd like to share with us to read right now?
Absolutely. So I'll be reading a few poems from this particular poetry manuscript, which is called Godsnack. And just to give some context, I know I've already told you all I write to and about a lot of different like female pop culture icons, but I think most simply in this manuscript, I'm looking at the intersections of feminism and godliness and pop culture. And so specifically, I'm looking at the idea of like the godly or the holy and how women have either been erased from those narratives and histories or misrepresented in them. So I'll just go from there and not over explain anything. But this will be the opening poem to sort of set context for the rest of the collection. And again, I think this sort of represents, this was one I had fun writing with. And it is called The Nuns, They've Drawn Me a Roadmap to Vegas. Go, child, they whisper in glances, in grace. Now, the men, they are coming. The men, they are always coming. So I go, I drive. I stop at a pilot station for coffee. I seek a break. The restroom mirror before me is spattered with soap and oil sprinkles, a constellation of time and grit and travelers, the North Star, all the women who went before me. It bridges my nose, almost freckles. I take out a tube of lipstick and I connect the dots on the mirror. What appears is an unfolding of history, of Marys and Magdalens, of Madonnas and Carringtons, and at the bottom, a legend that winks this way to the center of the cosmos. This next one, I think follows nicely because I mentioned Leonora Carrington, another big inspiration. So this was actually written when I was at a residency at the Sisters of Loretto. So this is called Leonora Carrington Visits the Sisters of Loretto. A hearing, a horn, a penny at the bottom of a well, a penny at the bottom of a lake, a wish, a vertebrate, a tantalizing snowstorm, a bucket and a well in a countryside of nuns and of cattle, and of roaring engines and of bantering wind. She opens her mouth and she opens her mouth and she opens her teeth and she gulps. But that's not possible. But it is, say her teeth. We're all a little bit weird here. We're all a little bit feared. The next one I have to share today is called I'm Beginning to Think I'm Not the Tattoo Type. 6 tattooed itself to 16. 16 tattooed itself to 30. That should be a comment on mathematics, the asymmetry of motion, but it's not. Today tattoos tomorrow, and so on. I just wish sometimes that I could wipe it off, dance myself clean as James Murphy would suggest. What I would give to wipe that smudge from my chin, that mistake from my hands. Is anyone beginning to see my point? I keep having this dream and I'm in this chair and there's a needle pricking my back and some woman is saying, don't forget you signed off on this. I feel the carving of a day, a thread, a hairline crack, and I tell a joke to distract myself from the noise time makes when it's at work. Knock, knock, it's me. Really, I'm here, and maybe this is no joke. Take 10, still me, a mouth, a sound, an echo. That's me too. The mouth or the sound or the echo, I can't say. I've got, let's see, 2 more I'm gonna read. So this next one I mentioned, turning to music for a lot of inspiration just to figure out where to jump from for a poem. And this one pulls the line from Fiona Apple's song, I'm good at being uncomfortable, so I can't stop changing all the time. And this is called Self-Portrait as a Broken Record. Ask me where I begin, and I'll say I'm good at being uncomfortable, so perhaps I am not broken if I can't stop changing all the time. I'll say I'm good at being uncomfortable, If I can't stop changing, I am all the time. I am perhaps a wannabe, or perhaps a repeating decimal of my childhood everlasting, or even perhaps not broken. I am, me's on a beam, warped perhaps, or something more like need, like I. Just come, listen closely. And then I have one more I'll share with you all today from this manuscript, and this one is called At My Last Supper, Play Me Laverne and Shirley. What if I told you we were all born of milk stirred into a cold Pepsi? Conception really just a quick tsunami of acid and cream that really we just fizzle into life, one long, slow dazzle. As a kid, I'd spent summers watching Laverne and Shirley with my mom. She'd descend the stairs with 2 surprise bowls of canned peaches and a bag of popcorn. At 12, when homesick at the summer camp I'd begged to go to, the sight of peaches in the mess hall brought me to tears. My mom, that gesture. Had I even really liked peaches that much? On the second to last day of camp, I fired a shotgun. Counselors chucked orange clay pigeons into the air, and I hit on my first try, a firework explosion of pulped clay. Afterward, the counselors gathered what fragments could be found in the brush and with care packaged them delicately into a Ziploc bag, like slivers of an orange packed for school lunch. These days, I sip on cold beer I only pretend came bottled from Milwaukee's Schatz Brewery at the hands of 2 women. And sure, an orange isn't a peach, but sometimes memory sure looks like one, unmended, messy, packed and waiting for its next big bang. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful. And milk and Pepsi, such a specific reference. I love that. Now, Haley, if you would, do you have an excerpt that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. Yeah. And thank you, everyone. Jeremy, Lisa, Megan, and Joanna, those pieces. I've written down so many different like phrases and books that I want to look up. I'm going to read from the story that was published a few years ago. It's called Not in Any Trouble. And yeah, I think I'm just going to read the first section. Something that I'm kind of self-conscious of is, I don't know if other people from Kentucky experience this. Like I don't have an accent in most spaces, but when I am around my family for a long time, it'll kind of come out. And when I'm reading about familiar childhood experiences, it'll kind of, so this is fiction, but I'm not affecting it. Like I'm not putting it on purpose. It just kind of like, it's a little, I feel a little douchey, but if you hear some of that start to come out, that's where it is. Okay, Not in Any Trouble. Our church hosted a lot of programs: Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Mercy Maternity for pregnant teens with nowhere to go, Women of Alabaster for trafficked girls who got out. Boone County used to be nicer when my dad was growing up here, but it's gotten pretty sick. That's how my parents taught me about the drugs and everything else that came with our people just not having enough. A sickness, a plague with victims, not criminals, except for the politicians and the men who sold girls. They can just go ahead and drop dead, my mom said. So we were used to desperate people coming to our church and rededicating their lives to the Lord. And nobody was surprised to see Clay Meredith there for the special spring break revival service, weeping at the altar in his big blue flannel shirt. From the pews, I watched him swim in his clothes and beg for God's forgiveness. He looked like war. His mother, our next door neighbor, wept with and over him, so hard that her nose bled. She bled all over her hands, all over Clay's shoulder. Later, people would call it a sign, all that blood. the best warning Christ could have given us that Wednesday night. I put my arm around his little brother, Braden, who was not his real brother. Braden was from the system. Braden stared at the carpet and trembled under my arm because Clay was a tornado, in and out of trouble, always coming through with no notice and leaving a fresh disaster. On the other side of me was the new girl, Sydney. Sydney was only 12, 2 years younger than me, but big-breasted and fluent in French. She went to private school. I was trying to befriend her because she had a certain confidence in her face, like she didn't need anybody, and my parents had said that I needed more girlfriends. Sydney never went to the children's service. It was hard to imagine her there, full-figured in a yellow plastic chair, coloring in Bible stories and eating goldfish crackers. But watching her watch Clay that night, I understood why maybe she shouldn't be in the adult service. She leaned all the way forward and flashed her wet eyes at the spectacle, like a fish caught on the line, like somebody had just slammed on the brakes. I put my arm around her too and wondered when somebody is old enough to watch a man crawl out of hell, to watch a mother bleed all over her prodigal son. This is the first section.
Thank you, Haley. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today on this session of the National Arts and Humanities Month webinar we're offering at the Kentucky Arts Council. Right now, my colleague Sarah Schmidt is going to launch a quick poll. It's just a couple of questions: how you heard about this series and what you'd like to see next from us in the Creative Industry Summit series. And while you're doing that, responding to that poll, I've got a few announcements I'd like to share myself. At 1 p.m. Eastern next Tuesday, October 31st, Halloween, we'll have a session on advocacy for nonprofit arts organizations. Very important topic. We've invited Kentuckians for the Arts to talk about advocating for public policy that supports the arts and the creative industry. Arts organizations' leadership can be powerful advocates in the state, and through this presentation, you'll learn more about how to build the capacity of your staff and board and make advocacy a part of your organization's culture. You won't want to miss that. Lastly, I would like to tease a KY Artscast episode coming out on Friday this week. The theme will be fitting for this ghostly season, so you won't want to miss it. You can go directly to kyartscast.ky.gov to listen to that episode, as well as all of our past episodes and some other bonus content that you can get access to. Thank you again for joining us today. Our writers, if you would please hang on the Zoom after everyone else checks out. We want to have a little post-show gathering, so thank you for joining us today.